My wife's dad arranged a dinner at an exclusive restaurant, but when I arrived, there was no seat reserved for me. He smirked. Maybe a budget place suits you better. I burst out laughing and asked the owner for a seat because the owner was. Before I reveal everything that happened to me, download your audiobook titled Brutal Cheating Stories That Shocked the World by clicking the link in the pinned comment. Look, I'm not the kind of guy who gets impressed by fancy restaurants, but I'll admit, Lou Ambrosia had me second-guessing my entire wardrobe the moment I stepped through those double doors. The place screamed money, and not the kind you get from a decent paycheck, but the kind that makes you wonder if the silverware is judging you. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like expensive disco balls, and the carpet was so plush I felt guilty walking on it with my department store shoes. Even the air smelled rich, like someone had bottled the essence of old money and spritzed it around the room every 15 minutes. I'd shown up exactly on time because that's what you do when your father-in-law makes a big deal about finally inviting you to one of his precious business dinners. Richard Hanover wasn't just any father-in-law. He was the kind of man who wore his net worth like a designer cologne and made sure everyone within a 5-meter radius knew about it. For the past 3 years of marriage to his daughter Lydia, I'd been treated like the help at every family gathering. The guy who married up and should be grateful he even got a seat at the kids' table. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to be my official welcome into the inner circle. Or so Lydia had promised me while picking out my tie this morning. The Matrai stood behind his fancy podium like a bouncer at the world's most exclusive club, eyeing me with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for people trying to return items without a receipt. He was tall, probably 6'3", with slick-back hair and a nose that looked like it had been specifically designed to look down at people. His tuxedo was so crisp it could have cut bread, and the little name tag pinned to his lapel read Bernard in gold lettering that probably cost more than my watch. "Good evening, sir," he said, his tone suggesting it was anything but good. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yeah, I do," I replied, flashing my best "I belong here" smile. "Should be under Richard Hanover, party of 6. Bernard's fingers danced across his tablet screen with the kind of theatrical flair that made me think he'd practiced this routine in front of a mirror. His eyebrows, perfectly manicured, naturally climbed higher with each swipe. After what felt like an eternity of watching this guy play Angry Birds with his reservation system, he looked up at me with an expression that somehow managed to be both apologetic and condescending at the same time. "I do see a reservation for Mr. Handover's party," he said slowly, like he was explaining quantum physics to a golden retriever. "However, I'm not seeing your name on the guest list, sir." I blinked. "Excuse me, the reservation is for 6 people." "Yes, but your name doesn't appear to be included in the party." He tilted his head slightly, and I swear I saw the corner of his mouth twitch with something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. A cold feeling started spreading through my chest. The kind you get when you realize you've been set up, but you're still hoping you're wrong. "Try again," I said, keeping my voice level even though my jaw was starting to clench. "The booking should be under Richard Hanover, my father-in-law. I'm Miles Hanover. Well, Miles Sullivan Hanover, technically, but I understand who you are, sir," Bernard interrupted, his professionalism cracking just enough to let some smugness leak through. "Unfortunately, the reservation specifically lists 5 other individuals, and your name is not among them." Before I could formulate a response that didn't involve flipping his precious podium, I heard it. A voice that had haunted my family dinners for 3 solid years, dripping with the kind of amusement that makes you want to check your back for knife wounds. "Oh, Miles." Richard Hanover materialized from the dining room like a villain in a bad soap opera, flanked by his 2 sons who looked like they'd been cloned from the same country club DNA. He was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my car payment, his silver hair perfectly styled and that trademark grin that made him look like a shark who just spotted a swimmer with a cramp. "You actually showed up." How optimistic of you. My wife Lydia trailed behind them, her eyes glued to her iPhone screen like it contained the secrets of the universe. She was wearing the black dress I'd complimented her on earlier, the one that made her look like she belonged in a place like this. Right now, she was doing an Oscar-worthy performance of someone who had absolutely no connection to the guy being humiliated in the lobby. "Richard," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "There seems to be some confusion with the reservation. Bernard here says I'm not on the list." Richard's grin widened, showing teeth that were definitely whitened by professionals. "Confusion? Oh no. No confusion at all. You're not on the list because you're not invited to this particular dinner." He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather, while his sons Blake and Connor started snickering behind their hands like 12-year-olds who just heard someone say the word duty. The lobby suddenly felt very quiet. A couple walking past slowed their pace, sensing drama the way sharks sense blood in the water. Even Bernard had stopped pretending to look at his tablet and was watching this unfold with barely concealed interest. "You're joking," I said, even though I knew he absolutely wasn't. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Richard spread his arms wide, playing to his audience. "Now, Miles, buddy. This is Lou Ambrosia. This is where serious people discuss serious business. You really thought I'd waste a seat at this table on someone who—" He paused for effect, looking me up and down like I was a stain on his expensive carpet. "Someone who works with computers all day? Maybe there's a nice burger joint down the street that's more your speed. I hear they have excellent chicken nuggets." Blake and Connor lost it completely, their laughter echoing through the lobby like a pack of hyenas who just cornered something weak. Lydia finally looked up from her phone, her expression carefully neutral, her lips pressed together in that way that meant she was either embarrassed or about to pretend she was. For 3 years, I'd taken Richard's jabs at family gatherings, the comments about my modest career, the jokes about how Lydia had settled, the not-so-subtle suggestions that I should let the real men handle the business discussions while I went to play with the kids. I'd smiled through it all because Lydia had asked me to, because she'd promised that eventually her father would come around, because I genuinely believed that being patient and respectful would eventually earn me some respect in return. But standing there in that lobby, with Richard's smug face grinning at me and my wife refusing to make eye contact, something inside me shifted. The patient, understanding son-in-law who'd spent 3 years trying to win over his in-laws. That guy just clocked out for the evening. My jaw tightened, my hands unclenched, and I felt a smile spreading across my face. Not the fake, polite smile I'd been wearing, but a real one. The kind of smile you get when you realize you're holding all the cards and everyone else is about to find out they've been playing poker with a card shark. "You know what, Richard?" I said, my voice cutting through the awkward silence. "You're absolutely right. This isn't my speed at all." Richard's grin faltered slightly, confusion flickering across his face. This wasn't the reaction he'd been expecting. "This is so much worse than I thought it would be." I continued, letting out a laugh that made Bernard take a small step back. It wasn't a nervous laugh or an angry laugh. It was the kind of laugh you give when you're about to enjoy something immensely. "What's so funny?" Richard demanded, his voice losing some of its confidence. I turned to Bernard, who was watching this exchange like it was the most entertainment he'd had all week. "Be a champ and call the owner out here, would you?" The lobby went silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Richard's smile had completely disappeared, replaced by a look of confusion mixed with irritation. Blake and Connor stopped laughing. Even Lydia looked up from her phone, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing together. "The owner," Richard repeated, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think the owner is going to come out here because you ask? You think?" "Oh, I don't think," I interrupted, still smiling. "I know. Trust me on this one, Richard. You're going to want to stick around for this part. Consider it free entertainment with your overpriced dinner." Richard's face was starting to turn an interesting shade of red, the kind that suggested his blood pressure was having opinions about this conversation.
This is ridiculous. Bernard, we're ready to be seated. Just deal with him.
But Bernard was already picking up the phone behind his podium, speaking in hushed tones to someone on the other end. I could see the wheels turning in Richard's head, trying to figure out what angle I was playing, what card I thought I had that would make any difference in this situation. Poor guy. He had no idea the show was just getting started. I adjusted my jacket, caught Lydia's eye for just a second. She looked away immediately and prepared myself for what was about to be the most satisfying dinner conversation the Hanover family had ever witnessed. The thing about rich people is they're not used to being told no, or wait, or basically anything that doesn't involve immediate gratification and someone kissing their imported Italian loafers.
So when Bernard hung up that phone and said,
"The owner will be right out, sir," you could practically see Richard's brain short-circuiting like a laptop that just got a virus. "The owner," Richard repeated, his voice climbing an octave. He looked at Bernard like the maître had just announced he was actually an alien. "Sebastian Cruz is going to come out here because this man asked for him?" I couldn't help it. I laughed again. Not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle, but a full-blown, from-the-gut laugh that echoed through the lobby and probably scared a few seer in the wine cellar. The kind of laugh that makes everyone within earshot stop their conversations and turn to see what's so hilarious. And boy, did they turn. I saw at least a dozen heads swivel in our direction, diamonds glinting on necks and wrists, probably wondering if they were missing out on some exclusive entertainment. Richard's face went through about 5 different shades of red, settling on something that reminded me of a fire hydrant having an identity crisis. "What exactly do you find so amusing, Miles?" "You," I said, wiping my eyes. "Mostly you, but also this whole situation. The setup, the dramatic reveal, the public humiliation. You really went all out with this one, Richard. I mean, you could have just uninvited me over text like a normal, passive-aggressive father-in-law, but no, you had to go for the full theatrical production. I respect the commitment. I really do." Blake stepped forward, puffing out his chest like a pigeon on steroids. At 28, he still had the energy of a frat boy who thought being loud made him important. "You need to leave, Miles. You're embarrassing yourself and our family." "Your family?" I corrected, pointing at him with a casual finger. "I'm just the guy who married into it. Big difference. And as for embarrassing, buddy, we haven't even gotten to the good part yet." Connor, the younger brother at 25, was scrolling through his phone, but clearly listening. He looked up with that trademark smirk that ran in the handover jeans. "Dude, are you having some kind of breakdown? Because this is getting weird even for you." "Weird?" I grinned at him. "Connor, my man, this isn't weird." Weird was last Thanksgiving when your dad spent 2 hours explaining to everyone at dinner why my job was essentially tech support. This is what we call a plot twist. Lydia finally found her voice, though she still wouldn't look directly at me. "Miles, please, let's just go. We can talk about this at home." Her voice had that pleading quality that used to make me back down, used to make me swallow my pride and walk away because keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity. Used to. "Nah, I'm good here," I said, leaning against Bernard's podium like I own the place. Which, well, spoiler alert, but we'd get to that. I mean, we're already here. The owner's coming out, and I'm pretty sure the couple by the window is live tweeting this whole thing. Might as well see it through. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a threatening whisper, but was really just loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but Sebastian Cruz is a personal friend of mine. We golf together. We're in the same investment club. Whatever fantasy you've cooked up in your head about him caring about you, it's just that. A fantasy investment club," I repeated, nodding thoughtfully. "That's cute. Which one? The one that meets at the Oakmont Country Club on Thursdays, or the one that meets downtown on Tuesdays? Richard blinked. How do you just curious? I interrupted, examining my nails like we were discussing the weather because I'm trying to remember which meetings you've been skipping lately. Sebastian mentioned something about your attendance being spotty. That was a lie. Actually, Sebastian hadn't mentioned anything about Richard's attendance because Richard and Sebastian weren't exactly the golf buddies Richard pretended they were. But watching Richard's face drain of color like someone had opened a valve was absolutely worth the creative storytelling. A woman in a sparkly dress who'd been walking past stopped completely, no longer even pretending she wasn't eavesdropping. Her husband tugged at her arm, but she shook him off, clearly invested in seeing how this played out. We were better than whatever Broadway show they'd probably seen last week. Bernard, to his credit, was maintaining his professional composure, but I caught him fighting a smile. The guy had probably seen hundreds of entitled rich people throw tantrums in this lobby, but this was apparently novel entertainment, even for him. You're bluffing, Richard said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. You don't know Sebastian Cruz. You probably looked him up on LinkedIn or something and think that makes you connected. LinkedIn, I snorted. Yeah, because that's exactly how highly business relationships work in 2025. Just send a connection request and boom, you're besties. Next, you'll tell me you think people still use Facebook. Blake jumped in, probably sensing his father floundering. Even if, and I mean if, you somehow know the owner, what exactly do you think is going to happen here? He's going to give you a table out of pity? That's embarrassing, man. Pity, I repeated, tasting the word. Interesting choice.
Is that what you'd call it when your dad got you that job at his friend's firm after you got fired from the last three? Or when Connor here got into business school after a generous donation from the Hanover Foundation? Because I'd love to know the technical definition you're working with. Connor's smirk disappeared faster than free food at a college party. That's different. Oh, absolutely, I agreed. Totally different. Your situations involved actual pity. Mine involved something way more interesting. The lobby was getting crowded now. A small crowd had formed at a respectful distance, pretending to check their phones or adjust their jewelry while obviously listening to every word. Lou Ambrosia was usually the kind of place where people whispered, where confrontations happened behind closed doors in private rooms, where scandal was avoided like carbs at a wedding. This was the social equivalent of a car crash on the freeway. Nobody wanted to admit they were looking, but nobody could look away. Lydia grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket. Miles, I'm begging you, please, just stop. You're making this worse. I looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since I'd arrived. Her makeup was perfect. Her hair was styled exactly the way her mother had always insisted looked appropriate. And her expression was the same carefully neutral mask she wore at every family function. The same mask she'd been wearing for 3 years while her father treated me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. Making it worse. I said softly just to her, Lydia, your dad literally uninvited me from a family dinner and announced it publicly. I'm pretty sure the worst part already happened. I'm just adding the interesting part. She let go of my arm like it had burned her. You're being childish, and you're being complicit, I shot back. But hey, we've all got our roles to play, right? Richard had been having a heated, whispered conversation with Blake, but now he turned back to me with renewed confidence. Oh, that was never a good sign. You know what? Fine. Let's say you do know Sebastian somehow. Maybe you fixed his computer once or helped him set up his email. Oh, here we go, I muttered. But that doesn't change the fact that you don't belong here. This restaurant, this lifestyle, this family. You're out of your depth, Miles. You always have been. Lydia deserves someone on her level. The crowd intake of breath was audible. Even Bernard looked uncomfortable now. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a door opened behind the Matra E station and footsteps echoed across the marble floor. The energy in the room shifted instantly like someone had flipped a switch. People straightened their postures, adjusted their clothes, put on their best behavior faces. Sebastian Cruz was about to enter the stage, and Richard Hanover had absolutely no idea that he'd just bought himself a front row seat to his own funeral. I adjusted my jacket one more time and smiled at Richard. Out of my depth. Rich, buddy, we haven't even gotten to the shallow end yet. The footsteps got closer. Showtime. Sebastian Cruz didn't just walk into a room. He made an entrance, like he was born to do it. Like every step was choreographed by someone who understood the dramatic impact of a perfectly timed appearance. The man was 56 but looked 40, with silver hair that probably cost more to maintain than most people's mortgages, and a suit that fit him so perfectly it might as well have been painted on. He had that kind of presence that made everyone else look like they were cosplaying as rich people while he was the real deal. The conversations in the lobby died like someone had hit a mute button. Even the woman in the sparkly dress who'd been blatantly eavesdropping suddenly found her shoes fascinating. Sebastian had that effect on people. Part respect, part fear, and part genuine admiration for someone who'd built an empire from a single food truck and turned it into a restaurant dynasty that stretched across 3 states. His eyes scanned the lobby, passed over Richard's group, and landed on me. And then, and this was the beautiful part, his entire face lit up like someone had just told him Christmas came early. Miles. Sebastian's voice carried across the lobby with that slight accent that hinted at his Puerto Rican heritage, the one he'd never bothered to hide, even when business consultants told him it might hurt his brand. Miles Sullivan. No way, man. I didn't know you were coming in tonight. He strode across the lobby like he owned the place, which, to be fair, he mostly did, and grabbed my hand in a shake that turned into one of those half-hug things that guys do when they're actually friends but don't want to seem too emotional about it. The kind of greeting you definitely don't give to someone who fixed your computer once. I grinned at him, feeling Richard's stare burning a hole in the side of my head. Sebastian, good to see you, man. It's been what, 3 months since the investor meeting? Too long, Sebastian said, clapping me on the shoulder. Way too long. You still dodging my calls about the downtown project, or are you finally ready to admit you missed the restaurant business? Richard made a sound somewhere between a cough and a choke. I didn't look at him yet. This moment was too delicious to rush. The downtown project is still on my radar, I said casually. My holding company is actually finalizing the lease agreements next week. Thought I'd let the lawyers earn their retainer for once. Sebastian laughed, the kind of genuine laugh that made everyone around him want to join in. Always the businessman. I keep telling you, Miles, you should have stayed in the game instead of selling out to chase tech money. Yeah, well, someone had to make the tech money to invest back into your restaurants, I shot back. Can't all be as naturally talented as you, chef. That's when Richard apparently decided he'd been ignored long enough. He cleared his throat with all the subtlety of a foghorn at a library. Sebastian, I didn't realize you knew my son-in-law. The way he said son-in-law made it sound like he was identifying a suspicious rash. Sebastian turned, and I watched his expression shift from warmth to professional courtesy in about half a second. Richard Hanover, right? We've met at a few charity events. The subtext was clear. We're not friends. I barely remember you. And I'm being polite because that's what you do in business. Yes, Richard said, trying to recover his earlier confidence. We're members of the same investment club. Actually, I didn't realize you and Miles were acquainted. Acquainted? Sebastian repeated, looking at me with raised eyebrows. That's one word for it. He turned back to Richard and his smile got sharper. Miles and I go way back. He was my business partner when I opened my first real restaurant. Not Lou Ambrosia, but the one before it. Stellar. Over in the meat-tacking district, I watched Richard's face cycle through several emotions. Confusion, disbelief, panic, and finally landing on something that looked like he'd just swallowed a live goldfish. Business partner Richard said, weakly. Co-owner. Actually, Sebastian continued, clearly enjoying himself now, professional restaurators can smell drama like sharks smell blood, and Sebastian was circling. Miles provided half the startup capital and handled all the business operations while I focused on the kitchen. We ran that place for 4 years before he sold me his share, used the money to fund this place. Actually, he gestured around the lobby like he was showcasing a prize. Lou Ambrosia exists because Miles took a risk on a chef with a dream and a food truck. Blake looked like someone had just explained quantum physics using only interpretive dance. Connor had actually dropped his phone. Lydia's carefully neutral expression had cracked into something resembling shock. And Richard looked like he was doing complex math in his head and not liking any of the answers he was getting. "You never mentioned this," Richard said to me, his voice tight. "In 3 years of marriage to my daughter, you never mentioned you owned restaurants?" "You never asked," I said simply. "You were too busy asking if I'd tried turning it off and on again and making jokes about my computer stuff to actually have a conversation about what I do." The crowd that had gathered, now including 2 waiters and a woman who looked like she might be someone's trophy wife or possibly a reality TV star, was eating this up better than any 5-star meal Sebastian could have cooked. Sebastian, bless him, was on a roll. Miles was one of the smartest business minds I'd ever worked with. Still is. When he told me he was getting out of the restaurant game to start a tech company, I thought he was crazy. But then his company took off and suddenly I'm the one asking him for business advice. He laughed and shook his head. Man's got a mind for numbers. That's honestly terrifying. I've watched him calculate profit margins in his head faster than my accountant can do it with a calculator. Tech company, Richard repeated like he was trying to process information his brain was refusing to accept. "You run a tech company, software development and business solutions," I said, examining my nails again. "We handle back-end infrastructure for about 60% of the major restaurant chains on the East Coast, including, funny enough, 3 of the places in your investment portfolio's hospitality sector." Richard's left eye twitched. Literally, twitched. It was glorious. $60 million valuation as of last quarter, I added, just because I could. Give or take what we spent on the new office space in Manhattan, but who's counting? Sebastian whistled low. 60 million. Last time we talked, you were at 45. Business must be good. Can't complain, I said. Turns out people really need their systems to work properly, and they're willing to pay premium prices for someone who can guarantee uptime. Who knew? Connor finally found his voice. Wait. You're telling us Miles is rich? Rich is subjective, Sebastian said diplomatically. Then he grinned at me. But yeah, Miles is doing pretty well for himself. Better than most of my investor friends, honestly. And he actually earned it instead of inheriting it, which he stopped himself, clearly realizing he was about to insult about 80% of his clientele. But the damage was done. Richard's face had gone from red to pale, cycling through colors like a mood ring, having an existential crisis. I don't understand, Lydia said, finally speaking. Her voice was small, confused, like she'd just discovered her husband of 3 years was actually a spy or something equally reality-shattering. Miles, you never told me you co-owned a restaurant. You never told me about Sebastian or Stellar or any of this. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something twist in my chest. Lydia, babe, you never asked. Every time I tried to talk about work, your dad would interrupt with some joke about IT support or make a comment about real business versus computer stuff. And you'd laugh along or change the subject. After a while, I stopped trying. That's not, she started, but nothing followed. Not what I pressed. Not fair, not true. Not the way you remember 3 years of family dinners where I was the punchline. Sebastian looked between us, clearly sensing he'd walked into something heavier than a simple reservation dispute.
Look, I don't want to get in the middle of family drama, but Miles, he turned to me with genuine warmth. You need a table tonight because I can sure as hell make that happen. That would be great, I said, smiling at him. Preferably somewhere with a good view. I'd hate to miss any of tonight's entertainment. Richard found his voice again, though it came out strangled.
Sebastian, surely you understand this is a private family dinner with my business partner. Sebastian interrupted smoothly, which makes it also a business dinner. And in my restaurant, business partners get treated right. He turned to Bernard. Get Mr. Sullivan the corner table, the one by the window. The corner table is reserved, Bernard started. Not anymore, Sebastian said firmly. Then he looked at Richard with a smile that could have cut glass. Unless, Mr. Hanover has a problem with how I run my restaurant. The silence that followed was so thick you could have served it as soup. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and finally managed, No problem at all. Perfect, Sebastian said brightly. He clapped me on the shoulder again. Miles, I've got to get back to the kitchen, Friday night rush and all, but let's catch up before you leave. I want to hear more about this downtown project. Absolutely, I said. Thanks, Sebastian. As he walked away, I turned back to Richard and his shell-shocked family. The lobby had gone from silent to buzzing with whispered conversations, people trying to piece together what they'd just witnessed. I smiled at Richard. A real, genuine smile. So, about that table. Bernard moved with the kind of efficiency you only see in people who've just realized their initial judgment was catastrophically wrong and they need to fix it before their boss notices. He snapped his fingers, actually snapped them like we were in a movie, and two servers materialized out of nowhere like they've been teleported in by some fancy restaurant magic. Gentlemen, please bring a chair to table 7, Bernard instructed, his tone completely different from the condescending draw he'd used on me 15 minutes ago. Mr. Sullivan will be joining the handover party. Joining? Richard choked out. He's joining our table. Well, I could take a table on the other side of the restaurant, I said thoughtfully, pretending to consider it. But that seems silly when there's a perfectly good family dinner happening right over there. Plus, Sebastian specifically said to give me the best seat in the house, and I'm pretty sure that means right next to the man of the hour. I watched Richard's jaw clench so hard I worried about his dental work. This is inappropriate. What's inappropriate? I said, walking past him toward the dining room. Is uninviting your son-in-law to a family dinner and then getting mad when he shows up anyway? That's like kicking someone out of a party and being shocked when they climb through the window. The math just doesn't work. Rich. The dining room at Lou Ambrosio was somehow even more pretentious than the lobby, if that was possible. Every table had fresh flowers that probably cost more than my first car. Candles flickered in holders that looked like they belonged in a museum, and the ceiling had some kind of mural painted on it that I'm pretty sure was supposed to be angels, but mostly just looked like chubby babies having an existential crisis. The lighting was that perfect dim that made everything look romantic and expensive, and soft classical music played from hidden speakers like we were all extras in a period drama. Table 7 was prime real estate right by the window overlooking the city with a view that probably added an extra $100 to every entree. Richard's family was already seated, his wife Margaret looking like she'd been carved from ice and disapproval. Blake and Connor flanking their father like bodyguards at a presidential dinner in an empty seat that I assumed was meant for Lydia. The servers descended on the table like a pit crew at a NASCAR race, rearranging place settings and somehow producing an extra chair that matched the others perfectly. They squeezed it in right between Richard and Blake, which meant I'd have a front row seat to Richard's inevitable meltdown. Perfect. This is ridiculous, Blake muttered as I sat down. But he moved over anyway, because what else was he going to do? Make a scene in front of everyone? Actually, knowing Blake, he probably would have, but his mother shot him a look that could have frozen lava. Margaret Hanover was a piece of work in her own right. She'd spent the last 3 years treating me like I was a phase Lydia was going through, like one day her daughter would wake up and realize she could do better. She wore pearls to breakfast and had opinions about table settings that she'd share whether you asked or not. Right now, she was looking at me like I was a stain on her tablecloth. "Miles," she said. "What a surprise, Margaret," I replied with my most charming smile. "Love what you've done with your hair. Is that a new style, or did you just forget to tell your stylist you wanted it to look intentional?" Her smile froze. Blake snorted despite himself. Connor was still staring at me like I just revealed I was actually an alien wearing a human suit. Lydia slid into the empty seat across from me, still refusing to make eye contact. She looked like she wanted to be anywhere else, maybe on a beach in Tahiti, or possibly in witness protection. A waiter appeared at my elbow with a menu bound in leather that probably had a higher thread count than my sheets. "Good evening, Mr. Sullivan. Can I start you off with something to drink?" "Yeah, I'll take whatever the most expensive whiskey you have is," I said. "Neat. And keep them coming. I have a feeling I'm going to need it." Richard made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a stroke. "Really? You're going to run up my bill now. Your bill." I raised my eyebrows. "Rich, I'm pretty sure Sebastian's going to calm my meal. Perks of being a former business partner. But hey, if you want to pick up the tab for everyone else, be my guest. I hear the truffle risotto is only $200 a plate." The waiter, who'd probably seen every kind of family drama this restaurant had to offer, somehow kept his expression perfectly neutral. "I'll get that whiskey right away, sir." As he disappeared, Margaret tried to salvage the situation with small talk because that's what people like her did. They ignored the nuclear bomb in the middle of the table and asked about the weather. "So, Miles, how has work been?" "Oh, you know," I said casually. Same old, same old. Just closed a $60 million valuation, hired 15 new developers, expanded into 3 new markets, and bought a penthouse in Manhattan. The usual." Connor choked on his water. Blake's fork clattered against his plate. Even Lydia looked up, her eyes wide. "A penthouse," Margaret repeated faintly. "In Manhattan?" "Well, technically it's in Tebeka, but yeah, great view. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, rooftop access, paid cash." I leaned back in my chair like we were discussing what I had for breakfast. Thought about financing it, but why pay interest when you don't have to, right? Richard's face had gone from pale to red again, cycling through his greatest hits of barely controlled rage. "You bought a penthouse in Tebeka, and you didn't think to mention this to your wife." I looked at Lydia, who was staring at her plate like it contained the answers to the universe. "I actually did mention it about 3 months ago." "Remember, Lydia? I said we should start looking at places in the city since we were spending so much time there for work. You said you didn't want to leave your apartment in Brooklyn because it had character." "I thought you meant rent," she said quietly. Not by should have been more specific, I guess. I shrugged, but yeah, the closing was last month. I've been having it furnished. Figured we could move in whenever you're ready. The waiter returned with my whiskey, and sure enough, it was the good stuff. The kind that came in a crystal glass that probably cost more than the actual whiskey. I took a sip and savored the burn. Worth every penny I wasn't paying for it. Blake couldn't seem to help himself. "So what, you're just rich now? Is that what we're supposed to believe?" "I mean, rich is such a relative term," I said thoughtfully. "Am I private jet rich? Not yet. Am I never have to work again rich? Yeah, pretty much. Am I richer than your dad rich?" I paused, looking at Richard. Honestly, probably. His real estate portfolio took a hit last quarter, something about over-leveraging in the commercial sector. I heard about it at an investor meeting. Rough stuff. Richard looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. "How do you know about my portfolio?" "Because my holding company bought half of it when you needed to liquidate assets." I said simply, "Did you not read the paperwork?" "Sullivan Holdings, LLC. That's me. Well, me and my business partners were the ones who bailed you out when that Atlantic City project went south." The silence at the table was deafening. Even the classical music seemed to have gotten quieter, like the speakers were leaning in to hear better. Margaret had gone pale.
Richard, is this true?
There were several investors in that deal, Richard stammered. I didn't realize the paperwork had so many LLCs and shell companies. Shell companies, I repeated, grinning. Rich, that's just good tax planning. Nothing shady about it. Well, mostly nothing shady. Lydia finally found her voice, though it came out small and confused. Miles, why didn't you tell me any of this? I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt that twist in my chest again. Lydia, I tried. Remember our second anniversary? I wanted to talk to you about my company going public. You said you were tired and wanted to watch Netflix instead. Remember last Christmas when I mentioned the Manhattan property? You changed the subject to ask your mom about wedding china patterns. Every time I tried to talk about work, about what I was actually building, your family either made jokes or talked over me. After 3 years of that, I just stopped trying. Before she could respond, Sebastian himself appeared at the table carrying a plate that looked like it belonged in an art museum. The steak on it was perfectly seared, surrounded by vegetables that had probably been individually selected by someone with a culinary degree and drizzled with a sauce that I couldn't identify but knew cost a fortune. Couldn't let anyone else serve this, Sebastian said, setting it in front of me with a flourish. Wagyu beef, dry-aged for 45 days, cooked exactly how you like it. Medium rare with just a touch of pink in the center, on the house, obviously. Sebastian, you don't have to. I started for old times. Richard's knuckles were white around his fork. Show was just getting started. The thing about uncomfortable silences at dinner tables is that someone always tries to fill them, usually with something that makes everything exponentially worse. Richard Hanover was apparently determined to be that someone tonight. Because after watching me demolish half my Wagyu steak while he picked at his salmon like it had personally offended him, he decided to try for a comeback. So, Miles, he said, his voice dripping with forced casualness that fooled absolutely nobody. You mentioned your little tech company. What exactly is it that you do again? Still fixing computers for people, or have you moved up to installing printers? Blake and Connor snickered on cue like trained seals who just heard their favorite sound. Margaret pursed her lips in what might have been disapproval, but could also have been her resting face. Hard to tell with her. Lydia pushed her risotto around her plate, creating abstract art with $200 ingredients. I took a slow sip of my whiskey, letting the question hang in the air long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. The couple at the next table had completely given up on pretending they weren't listening and were now blatantly watching us like we were dinner theater they'd paid extra for. You know, Richard, that's a great question, I said finally, setting down my glass. I run a software development and business infrastructure company. We specialize in back-end systems for large-scale operations, restaurants, hotels, retail chains, that sort of thing. Basically, we build the technology that keeps businesses running smoothly without anyone noticing it exists. Kind of like how plumbing works, except instead of water, we're moving data, and instead of pipes, we're using code. So, IT support. Blake interjected, grinning like he'd just won an argument. Sure, if support included designing proprietary systems from scratch, implementing machine learning algorithms for inventory prediction, and consulting on digital transformation strategies for Fortune 500 companies, I said cheerfully. But yeah, totally the same as helping someone reset their password. You really nailed it, Blake. Gold star for you. Connor leaned forward, his phone finally abandoned on the table. Come on, man. You can't seriously expect us to believe you're making that kind of money from some tech startup. Do you know how many tech companies fail every year? I do, actually. I replied, 90% within the first 5 years. That's why the 10% that succeed tend to do really, really well. Supply and demand, basic economics. You did take Econ 101 before you dropped out of business school, right, Connor?
His face went red. I didn't drop out. I transferred after failing 2 semesters. Yeah, I remember. I said, your dad was pretty vocal about it at Thanksgiving 2 years ago. Something about you finding your path, which is rich people code for, we're disappointed but too polite to say it directly. Margaret gasped. Miles, that's uncalled for. You know what else is uncalled for? I countered. 3 years of family dinners where your husband made jokes about my career being essentially glorified tech support while I smiled and took it because I was trying to be a good son-in-law. But hey, we all have different definitions of uncalled for. Richard slammed his wine glass down hard enough that the stem should have cracked. Enough. You want to talk numbers? Fine. Let's talk numbers. What's your company actually worth, Miles? And I want real numbers, not some inflated Silicon Valley fantasy valuation where you're counting potential instead of profit. I smiled. This was it. The moment I've been waiting for all night. Sure thing, Rich. My company, Sullivan Tech Solutions, was independently valued last quarter at $60 million. Not venture capital funny money, not projected future earnings, actual audited real valuation based on current revenue streams, client contracts, and market position. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the kitchen staff clattering dishes 3 rooms away. 60 million. Richard repeated slowly like he was trying to translate a foreign language and failing. Give or take, I said casually. We spent about $2 million on the new Manhattan office space. Open floor plan, private offices for senior staff, espresso machine that costs more than most people's cars. The usual startup stuff. Oh, and we acquired a smaller competitor last month for about $5 million, which will probably bump our valuation up another 10 or 15 once we integrate their client base. Blake's mouth was hanging open like a broken garage door. Connor had picked his phone back up, but wasn't actually looking at it. He was just holding it like a security blanket. Margaret looked like she was recalculating every interaction we'd ever had and not liking the results. But Richard looked like someone had just explained that water was actually dry and the sky was green, and everything he believed about the universe was wrong. That's he started, then stopped. That's not possible. You're 32 years old. 33, actually, I corrected. Birthday was last month. Nobody in this family remembered, but that's cool. I bought myself a Tesla as a present. The Model S Plaid, if you're curious, goes 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds. It's like riding a very expensive lightning bolt. Lydia made a small sound that might have been a sob or might have been disbelief. Your birthday? Oh my God, Miles, I forgot your birthday. You've forgotten the last 2, I said without looking at her. I stopped mentioning them because watching you panic buy me a gift card to Best Buy got depressing. For all your computer needs, you wrote on the card last time. Like I was going to go buy a new mouse or something. I didn't know what else to get you, she said quietly. How about asking what I wanted? I suggested, or paying attention to literally anything I said about my life. But sure, Best Buy gift cards work too. I donated them to a high school robotics team. At least someone got use out of them. Richard found his voice again, though it had lost all its earlier bravado. $60 million. You're sitting on $60 million, and you let us think you were barely scraping by. I never said I was scraping by, I corrected. You assumed that because I don't drive a Ferrari or wear a Rolex or do any of the other peacocking that people in your circle do to prove they have money. I prefer investing my cash into things that grow instead of depreciating assets that scream, I'm compensating for something. Blake bristled. Are you saying my Porsche is compensating for something? Blake, buddy, I'm saying your Porsche is definitely compensating for something, but this probably isn't the right venue to discuss your personal inadequacies. I took another bite of steak. We can have that conversation later if you want. I've got charts. Connor laughed despite himself, then tried to cover it with a cough when Blake glared at him. And Lydia?
Richard turned to his daughter, his voice taking on that dangerous edge that meant he was about to say something he'd regret. You knew about this? You knew your husband was running around with millions of dollars and you didn't think to mention it to your family? Lydia looked up, her eyes wide. I didn't know, Dad. I swear I had no idea about any of this. Miles never told me about the valuation or the penthouse or Sebastian or because you never asked. I interrupted gently but firmly. Lydia, every time I tried to talk about work, you'd zone out or change the subject. Remember when I tried to explain what my company did at your birthday dinner last year? You told me it was too technical and asked your mom about wedding venues instead. We've been married 3 years. What wedding were you planning? She didn't have an answer for that. Margaret cleared her throat delicately, which was her way of demanding attention without actually demanding it. Miles, I think what Richard is trying to understand is why you've been so secretive about your success. It seems rather deceptive. Deceptive? I repeated, laughing without humor. Margaret, I showed up to family dinners in regular clothes and didn't brag about my money. That's not deceptive. That's called being a normal person. What's deceptive is your husband pretending we're close enough to golf together when he's been systematically excluding me from family events for 3 years. That's not Richard started. Tonight, I said, cutting him off. Literally. Tonight, you uninvited me from a family dinner and made jokes about burger joints. You did that. I didn't show up here lying about who I am. You all just made assumptions, and I got tired of correcting them. The waiter appeared at the worst possible moment, professionally oblivious to the thermonuclear family drama unfolding at table 7. How is everything tasting this evening? Like victory, I said, raising my whiskey glass with notes of shot and Freya and a hint of justified satisfaction. Chef's kiss, really. The waiter blinked, nodded slowly, and backed away like he'd just stumbled into a crime scene. Richard leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. You think you're very clever, don't you? Coming here, embarrassing me in front of everyone, throwing your money around like it makes you better than us. Better than you? I considered it. Nah. Richer than you? Definitely. More honest than you? Absolutely. More entertaining at dinner parties? I mean, the crowd seems to think so. I gestured vaguely at the surrounding tables where at least 6 people were actively watching our drama unfold. This is insane, Blake muttered. This whole night is insane. Insane is thinking you could humiliate someone in public and not have it backfire. I said this is just basic cause and effect. Your dad threw the first punch. I'm just showing him what a counterpunch looks like when it's backed by $60 million and 0 remaining patience for his. Richard stood up, so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. Actually, I said, not standing, just looking up at him calmly. You kind of do, because if you leave now, everyone in this restaurant will know that Richard Hanover got put in his place by the son-in-law he's been treating like garbage for 3 years. But if you sit down, eat your overpriced salmon, and act like an adult, maybe we can all pretend this was just a spirited family discussion. The restaurant had gone quiet. Even the classical music seemed to be holding its breath. Richard looked around, saw all the eyes on him, and slowly, painfully, sat back down. I smiled and raised my glass. There we go. See, we're all capable of making good decisions when properly motivated. Richard had gone quiet after sitting back down, which was probably a first in his entire life. The man looked like he was chewing on glass and trying to smile through it, stabbing at his salmon with the kind of aggression usually reserved for people with serious anger management issues. Blake and Connor had retreated into their phones like millennials hiding from confrontation, which was exactly what they were doing. Margaret was sipping her wine with the careful precision of someone who'd just realized the Titanic was sinking and she'd left her life jacket at home. But Lydia was the interesting one. She sat across from me, her untouched risotto getting cold, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying or possibly trying to fold herself into another dimension where this dinner wasn't happening. Her face had that blank expression she always got when things got uncomfortable. The same look she'd had when her dad made jokes about my computer stuff at Thanksgiving, or when her brothers would ask if I'd figured out how to fix their Wi-Fi yet at Christmas. That carefully constructed mask of neutrality that said she was present in body but had mentally checked out to somewhere more pleasant, probably a beach in the Maldives or literally anywhere that wasn't Table 7 at Lou Ambrosia. For 3 years I'd watched her do this disappearing act. For 3 years I'd made excuses for it. Told myself she was just keeping the peace, being diplomatic, choosing her battles. But sitting here now, watching her refuse to meet my eyes while her father processed the fact that his loser son-in-law was worth more than his entire real estate portfolio, I realized something that probably should have been obvious way earlier. Lydia had been choosing sides this whole time, and it had never been mine. "Lydia," I said, not unkindly, just her name hanging in the air between us like a question she didn't want to answer. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine for maybe the first time all evening. They were the same eyes I'd fallen for 4 years ago at that charity gala where we'd both been bored out of our minds and bonded over making fun of the ice sculpture. Back then, those eyes had seemed warm, interested, like she actually wanted to know who I was beyond my tax bracket. Now they just looked scared. "What?" she asked quietly, like she was afraid of what I might say. "You've been awfully quiet," I observed, taking another sip of my whiskey. Usually by this point in a family dinner, you're at least pretending to participate in the conversation. Tonight, you're doing a great impression of a mannequin who's having an existential crisis. Blake snorted, then tried to cover it when Lydia shot him a look that could have stripped paint. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've clearly planned this whole thing, showing up here, the Sebastian reveal, telling everyone about your company, the penthouse. What am I supposed to say?" "How about the truth?" I suggested. "That would be refreshing. Or an opinion, or literally anything that suggests you have thoughts about what's happening right now." She looked down at her plate again. "I'm processing." "Processing," I repeated. "Right. You've been processing for 3 years, Lydia. At what point does processing turn into actual decision-making?" Margaret made a small sound of disapproval. "Miles, this is hardly the time." "Margaret, with all due respect, which at this point is none, this is exactly the time," I said, not taking my eyes off Lydia because I'm sitting here realizing that my wife has let her family treat me like garbage for our entire marriage and said nothing. Not defended me, not stood up for me, not even pulled me aside later to say, "Hey, maybe my dad was being a jerk." Nothing. Just silence. And that blank stare she's giving her risotto right now. "That's not fair," Lydia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You know what's not fair?" I leaned forward, begging me to blend in with your family, asking me to let your dad handle the business talk at dinners, telling me it was easier if I just didn't mention work around your brothers because they were sensitive about career stuff. You asked me to make myself smaller, Lydia. And I did. I spent 3 years making myself so small that your family forgot I was even a person. And you let them. A woman at the next table was openly staring now, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Her date was trying to get her attention, but she shushed him without looking away from our table. We were better than whatever they had ordered for dessert. "I was trying to keep the peace," Lydia said, her voice cracking slightly. "My family is difficult. I know that, but they're still my family. I thought if you just gave them time, they come around." "Time?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lydia, it's been 3 years. Your dad has had approximately 1,000 opportunities to come around. Instead, he got worse. The jokes got meaner. The exclusions got more obvious. And tonight, he literally uninvited me from a family dinner and announced it in public.
At what point were you planning to step in? She didn't answer, just twisted her napkin in her lap like it had personally wronged her. Richard, who'd been silent during this exchange, finally found his voice again.
Now wait just a minute. Richard, I swear to God, if you interrupt this conversation, I will buy this restaurant just so I can ban you from it, I said without looking at him. Your daughter and I are talking. You can wait your turn. He shut up, probably because he was realizing I wasn't bluffing about the restaurant thing. I turned back to Lydia. You want to know the worst part? I kept waiting for you to ask about my work, about my day, about what I was building. I kept thinking that eventually you'd be curious about what your husband actually did for a living beyond the vague tech stuff you told your friends when they asked. But you never did. You never asked about the long nights, the investor meetings, the product launches, the hiring decisions. You never asked why I was stressed or excited or frustrated. You just didn't care. That's not true, she protested. But it was weak. I care about you. You care about the version of me that fits into your life, I corrected. The guy who shows up to family dinners and laughs at your dad's jokes and doesn't make waves. But the actual me, the guy who built a $60 million company from scratch, the guy who co-founded a restaurant with Sebastian Cruz, the guy who bought a penthouse in Tebeka. You don't know that person because you never bothered to look. Connor, who'd been silent this entire time, suddenly spoke up. Dude, maybe you should have tried harder to tell her about all this stuff. I turned to him slowly. Connor, I'm going to explain something to you that might blow your mind, so buckle up. In a healthy relationship, both people show interest in each other's lives. You don't have to chase your spouse down and force them to care about what you do. They should want to know. Lydia didn't want to know because knowing would have meant confronting the fact that her family was wrong about me, and that was too uncomfortable. Lydia's eyes were getting shiny now, that pre-crying look that used to make me want to comfort her to fix whatever was wrong. Now I just felt tired. Miles, I'm sorry, she said, her voice shaking. I should have asked more questions. I should have stood up to my dad. I should have. You should have treated me like a partner. I finished, like someone whose life mattered as much as yours. But you didn't. And now we're sitting here in the fanciest restaurant in the city, and you're finding out about my life from Sebastian Cruz and your dad's humiliation instead of from me. Because somewhere along the way, we stopped being a team. The silence at the table was oppressive now. Even Blake and Connor had the decency to look uncomfortable, like they were witnessing something they shouldn't be seeing. When Lydia finally spoke again, her voice was barely audible. Miles, you never told me you were a co-founder of Stellar. You never mentioned Sebastian or any of it. I smiled, but it was sad this time, not triumphant. You never asked, Lydia. Not once in 3 years did you ask about my past, my career before we met, what I'd done before starting the tech company. You knew I had money when we got married. You had to, given our wedding and the house we bought, but you never asked where it came from. You just accepted it and moved on. I thought you'd tell me if it was important, she said weakly. Everything about my life should have been important to you, I replied. That's kind of how marriage works. But you were so busy trying to manage your family's perception of me that you forgot to actually get to know me. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, which was rich considering she'd been part of the problem this whole time. This is all very dramatic, but surely we can discuss this at home in private? No, I said firmly. We're doing this here now because private conversations haven't worked. I've tried private conversations. I've tried hints. I've tried direct statements. Nothing got through. So now we're doing public in the same restaurant where Richard decided to publicly humiliate me. Seems fitting. Lydia was crying now, silent tears running down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and comfort her, fall back into the pattern of making everything okay, smoothing things over. But I didn't, because for the first time in 3 years I was finally telling the truth, and it felt too good to stop now. Blake had been stewing in his own inadequacy for about 10 minutes, watching his sister cry silently while their father looked like he'd aged a decade in the span of one dinner service. And apparently, he'd reached his breaking point. He pushed his plate away, barely touched, because rich people love wasting food at expensive restaurants, and fixed me with what he probably thought was an intimidating stare, but really just made him look constipated. "So, you're rich now," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of resentment that comes from realizing your trust fund doesn't make you special anymore. "Congratulations, Miles. You've got money. You win." "Is that what you want to hear?" I set down my fork, took a moment to finish chewing my absolutely perfect Wagyu beef, and looked at him with the kind of patience you'd give a toddler who just asked why the sky is blue. "Blake, my guy, I need you to understand something that's going to fundamentally rock your world. I've been rich, like rich, for years, plural. You're just now poor enough to notice." The table went dead silent. Even Connor, who'd been trying to become one with his phone, looked up with his mouth hanging open. Margaret made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a hiccup. Richard's face cycled through about 17 different shades of crimson, and Sebastian, beautiful, perfect Sebastian, who'd been walking past our table to check on other guests, stopped in his tracks and actually snorted. Like full-on snorted with laughter. The kind of undignified sound that you definitely don't expect from a 5-star restaurant owner who's supposed to maintain an image of sophisticated elegance. "I'm sorry," Sebastian said, not sounding sorry at all. "I shouldn't laugh, that's unprofessional, but damn, Miles, that was cold." He was grinning like someone had just told him the best joke he'd heard all year. Blake's face went red. "Excuse me." "You heard me," I said, leaning back in my chair like I owned it, which, given my history with Sebastian, I kind of did in a spiritual sense. "You drive a Porsche that you didn't pay for, or watches your dad bought you, and work at a company where you got the job because of whose son you are? You've been coasting on inherited wealth your entire life, thinking that made you successful. Meanwhile, I built a company from scratch, sold a restaurant partnership for millions, and created actual value instead of just spending what Daddy gave me. So yeah, I've been rich. You've just been adjacent to money and confused the two." Connor let out a low whistle. "Dude, that's harsh." "Truth usually is," I replied, taking another sip of whiskey. "But hey, Blake wanted to talk about money. I'm just being honest about the situation." Richard slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the silverware jump, and several nearby diners look over with expressions ranging from concern to excited anticipation. We'd officially become the dinner theater everyone hoped they'd get when they made reservations at a fancy restaurant. "You have no right to speak to my son that way." "Richard, I have every right," I said calmly. "Your son just tried to minimize my success by framing it as something new, like I got lucky with a lottery ticket. I'm simply correcting the record. Blake's been living off your money his whole life. I made my own. There's a difference. And Blake's uncomfortable with that difference because it means he's never actually accomplished anything on his own." Blake stood up so fast his chair actually did tip over this time, clattering against the floor with a sound that echoed through the suddenly very quiet dining room. "You're Anne. You know that?" "Yep," I agreed cheerfully. "But I'm a self-made, which is better than being Anne by inheritance. At least I earned it." Sebastian was trying so hard not to laugh that his shoulders were shaking. He caught my eye and gave me a subtle thumbs up before attempting to compose himself into something resembling professional dignity. It wasn't working. The man looked like he was going to burst. A waiter, not our waiter, but a brave soul from across the restaurant, rushed over to pick up Blake's fallen chair, his eyes wide like he'd just witnessed a car accident, but couldn't look away. The couple at the next table had completely abandoned their meal and were watching us with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for playoff games or
reality TV finales. Margaret tried to salvage the situation with her trademark passive-aggressive diplomacy. I think perhaps we're all letting our emotions get the better of us. This is a family dinner, after all. We should be supporting each other, not tearing each other down.
Margaret, that ship sailed when your husband publicly uninvited me to this dinner, I said, not unkindly. We passed supportive family dinner about 45 minutes ago. Right now, we're somewhere between intervention and Greek tragedy. And honestly, I'm here for it. Richard finally seemed to recover some of his composure, though his voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. You think money gives you class, Miles? You think throwing around your wealth and humiliating my family makes you better than us? No, I said simply. Money doesn't give anyone class. If it did, you'd be the classiest guy in this restaurant, instead of the one having a very public meltdown because his son-in-law turned out to be more successful than he is. Sebastian, who'd been trying to sneak away to let us have our family drama in relative privacy, paused and turned back. Actually, Richard, I've got to side with Miles on this one. Richard looked at Sebastian like he'd just been betrayed by his own dog. What? Miles has been coming to my restaurants for years, Sebastian said, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine respect. Never once has he name-dropped his money, demanded special treatment, or acted like he was better than anyone else. He tips well, treats the staff with respect, and actually knows the names of the servers who work here regularly. Meanwhile, you've been here maybe 6 times, and I've had to comp 2 meals because you complained they weren't up to standard when, really, you just wanted free food. The silence that followed was so profound, I'm pretty sure I could hear someone's heart breaking. Possibly Richard's. Possibly his ego's. Hard to tell the difference with guys like him. But it gets better, Sebastian continued, clearly enjoying himself now. Miles here? He's on the investor list for this restaurant. Has been since we opened. Which means, technically, Richard, you're eating in a restaurant that Miles partially owns. So when you say money doesn't buy class, you're saying it in a building that Miles's money helped build. I hadn't actually known I was still on the investor list. Sebastian and I had restructured our partnership years ago, and I'd assumed he'd bought out my shares completely. Apparently not. But I wasn't about to correct him in front of Richard because the look on my father-in-law's face was worth more than any investment return. You're joking, Richard said weakly. Nope, Sebastian replied cheerfully. Check the incorporation documents. Sullivan Holdings, LLC, owns about 15% of Lou Ambrosia, which means Miles here could technically make decisions about who gets reservations. He paused, letting that sink in. Not that he would, because unlike some people, he's not petty. I raised my whiskey glass. I prefer to think of it as strategically patient. Connor was laughing now, actually laughing, apparently having reached the point where the absurdity of the situation overrode his family loyalty. This is insane. This whole night is completely insane. Insane is thinking you can publicly humiliate someone without consequences. I said this is just cause and effect. Newton's third law applied to family dynamics. Your dad pushed, I pushed back harder, and now we're all discovering that physics applies to egos, too. Lydia, who'd been silent through this entire exchange, finally spoke up. Her voice was from crying. Her makeup was ruined, and she looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Miles, can we please just go home? Please? I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman I'd married 3 years ago. The one who'd promised we'd be partners, that we'd face everything together. Except we hadn't been partners. We'd been 2 people living parallel lives, intersecting only at family dinners, where her family reminded me I didn't belong, and she said nothing. Sure, I said, standing up, but I'm taking my steak to go. This is too good to waste. Richard's face went purple. You think you can just waltz in here, destroy my family dinner, and leave? Richard, I didn't destroy anything.
I said calmly, signaling for our waiter. You destroyed it when you decided to play power games with someone who had more power than you realized. I just showed up and revealed the truth. That's not destruction. That's illumination. Sebastian nodded approvingly. Poetic. I like it. Can I get a to-go box for this steak? I asked the waiter, who appeared so fast he must have been hovering nearby, waiting for his cue. And maybe some of that truffle sauce on the side. Of course, Mr. Sullivan, he said, practically sprinting away. Blake was still standing, still fuming, still looking like he wanted to punch something, but was too well-bred to actually do it. This isn't over. Oh, Blake, it's so over. I said this is the most over something has ever been. This is over and disco. We're past over and well into the aftermath phase. Margaret stood up, gathering her clutch purse with shaking hands. Richard, we should go. This has been humiliating enough. Humiliating, I repeated, smiling. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Funny how that works, isn't it? You came here planning to humiliate me, and instead you got a mirror held up to your own inadequacies. That's what we in the business world call poor strategic planning. Richard stood up too, pulling out his wallet like he was going to pay for dinner and salvage some dignity. Sebastian stopped him with a gentle hand. Dinner's covered, Sebastian said. Consider it a courtesy for all the entertainment you've provided my guests tonight. I haven't seen this much drama since that reality TV star proposed to his girlfriend in the middle of service and she said no. The surrounding tables erupted in poorly suppressed laughter. Richard stormed out, Margaret following. Blake and Connor trailing behind like ducklings following their mother. Lydia stood there, caught between her family and me, looking lost. You coming? I asked her. She looked toward the door where her family had disappeared, then back at me. For a moment I thought she might actually make a choice. Then she grabbed her purse and followed them. I wasn't surprised. Just when I thought the evening had peaked, Richard's ego shattered, Blake's inadequacy exposed, and my steak perfectly prepared for a to-go box, Sebastian decided to add one more cherry on top of this absolute disaster Sunday of a family dinner. He'd been making his rounds through the dining room, checking on other tables, and probably enjoying the gossip that was definitely spreading about Table 7 like wildfire through a California forest. When he circled back to us with that particular gleam in his eye, that meant he was about to say something interesting. Hey, Miles, he said casually, like we were just two old friends catching up and not in the middle of a family implosion that would probably be discussed in therapy sessions for years to come. We're still on for that new restaurant deal, right? The one downtown near the financial district? I'd been in the process of standing up, ready to collect my to-go steak and my dignity and head out before things got even more awkward, if that was possible. But Sebastian's question made me pause, and I could feel the shift in the room's energy like someone had just changed the channel from a drama to a thriller. Of course we're still on, I said, settling back into my chair because apparently we weren't done here yet. The universe had one more act to perform. My holding firm is finalizing the lease agreements next week. Should be pretty straightforward. The building owner's been eager to close since we made the offer. Sebastian grinned. Good. I've already got the architect drawing up plans. This one's going to be different from Lou Ambrosia. More modern, younger crowd, fusion cuisine. I'm thinking we could pull in the after-work financial sector crowd, get them hooked early in their careers. Smart, I agreed. Build brand loyalty while they're still associates making decent money. Then keep them as clients when they make partner and actually have the income to drop $500 on dinner. Long-term thinking. I like it. Richard, who'd been halfway out of his chair preparing to leave in whatever remained of his dignity, froze, like someone had hit pause on a remote control. His face, which had just started to return to a normal human color, went pale. You're holding firm? I looked at him, finding confusion. Yeah, my holding firm. Sullivan Holdings, LLC. We handle my business investments, real estate acquisitions, that sort of thing. Pretty standard stuff for anyone managing multiple income streams and investment properties.
You have a holding firm, Richard repeated slowly, like I just told him I had a pet dragon or secretly worked for the CIA. Well, yeah, I said. What? You thought I just kept $60 million in a checking account? Rich, my man, that's not how wealth management works. You've got to diversify, create separate entities for liability protection, optimize the tax structure. It's business 101.
Didn't they teach you this at whatever fancy business school you went to? Connor let out a snort that he tried to disguise as a cough. Even Margaret looked interested now, her earlier mortification temporarily overridden by curiosity about just how deep this rabbit hole went. Sebastian, bless his heart, was enjoying this way too much. Miles's holding company has been super helpful in the expansion plans. They've got connections with commercial real estate developers all over the tri-state area. Actually made the downtown deal possible. The building owner wasn't interested in selling until Sullivan Holdings made an offer. How much of an offer? Blake asked, apparently unable to help himself despite his earlier humiliation. $7 million, I said casually, like I was discussing the price of a used Honda instead of a building in Manhattan's financial district. The property's worth about 12, but it needed renovations, and the owner wanted out quickly. We negotiated him down, threw in a quick closing, and everyone walked away happy. Lydia made a small sound from beside her mother. She'd been crying quietly, probably hoping everyone would forget she existed. But now she was staring at me like I just revealed I was secretly Batman. Miles, you bought a building? A $7 million building? Well, technically the holding company bought it, I corrected. I'm just the majority shareholder. But yeah, essentially it's a good investment. Prime location, solid bones. Once we do the renovations, it'll probably appraise for 15, maybe 16 million. That's a solid return over 2 years. Richard sat back down, not because he wanted to, but because I'm pretty sure his legs had stopped working. His face had gone through the entire color spectrum and landed on something resembling old oatmeal. You're telling me your holding company bought a building in Manhattan? Yeah, I finished. That's kind of what holding companies do. Rich. They hold things. Properties, investments, business interests. It's in the name. How many properties? Margaret asked, and I had to give her credit. At least she was asking direct questions instead of just sputtering like her husband. I thought about it. In the holding company, about 12, I think, maybe 13 now. I'd have to check with my property manager. We've got 3 commercial properties in Manhattan, 2 in Brooklyn, a couple of residential properties we rent out in Queens, and some retail space in New Jersey, plus the restaurant partnerships with Sebastian. Obviously, the silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming. Someone at a nearby table dropped their fork and it clattered against their plate like a gunshot. 13 properties, Richard croaked. You own 13 properties. The holding company owns them, I clarified again. I just own the holding company. Along with my business partners, we've got a few other investors in the LLC, but yeah, I've got majority stake. Sebastian was grinning like the Cheshire Cat on cocaine. Miles is being modest. His holding company has been one of the most aggressive buyers in the commercial real estate market over the last 2 years. Everyone in the restaurant industry knows Sullivan Holdings. They've been snapping up prime locations and renovating them before flipping them or leasing them to businesses like mine. Everyone knows. Richard's voice had gone up an octave. He sounded like a balloon slowly deflating. Everyone in the industry knows about Sullivan Holdings. Well, yeah, Sebastian said they're major players. I've got 3 friends who've tried to get Sullivan Holdings to invest in their restaurant concepts. Miles's team is super selective, though. They only take on projects with solid fundamentals and experienced management. My team, I added helpfully, consists of 2 property managers, a commercial real estate attorney, an acquisition specialist, and a financial analyst, plus our administrative staff. It's a small operation, relatively speaking, but we're efficient. Connor was doing math on his phone, his fingers flying across the calculator app. Dude, if you own 13 properties in the New York area and they're all worth millions each, that means
That means my real estate portfolio is separate from my tech company valuation. I interrupted. 2 different income streams, 2 different asset categories. The $60 million from Sullivan Tech Solutions, that's just the business. The real estate holdings are probably worth another 30, maybe 40 million, depending on current market conditions. I haven't had everything appraised recently. Blake made a sound like he was being strangled. You're worth $100 million, give or take, I said with a shrug. Net worth is complicated. You've got to factor in liabilities, outstanding loans, market volatility, but yeah, somewhere in that neighborhood. Again, it's hard to be precise without doing a full accounting, and honestly, who has time for that? Richard looked like he was having a medical emergency. His face had gone from oatmeal to chalk white, and he was gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. This is impossible. You're 33 years old. 33 and very good at business, I corrected. Turns out when you actually work hard instead of coasting on family money, you can accomplish quite a bit. Who knew? Margaret had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Richard, did you know about any of this? Of course I didn't know, Richard snapped, his voice cracking. He never said anything. 3 years he's been married to our daughter, and he never mentioned that I was incredibly successful. I finished. Yeah, weird how that never came up during all those family dinners where you were making jokes about my computer stuff and suggesting I'd be more comfortable at a burger joint. Really mysterious why I didn't feel compelled to share my financial details with. Sebastian checked his watch, clearly remembering he had an actual restaurant to run, but he couldn't resist one more bomb. Oh, and Richard, that real estate portfolio you mentioned earlier, the one that Sullivan Holdings bought into last quarter? Richard looked up, his eyes hollow. What about it? Miles's holding company owns it now, Sebastian said cheerfully. Well, half of it, anyway. The other half is still yours, but Sullivan Holdings is your majority partner. Didn't you read the acquisition paperwork? The world stopped spinning for a moment. Even the other diners who'd been pretending not to listen gave up all pretense and just turned to stare openly. What? Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. I smiled. A real, genuine smile this time. Oh, did Lydia not tell you? Sullivan Holdings, LLC acquired 51% of Hanover Real Estate Investments last quarter when you needed capital after that Atlantic City casino deal went sideways. We restructured the debt, brought in new management, and stabilized the portfolio. You're welcome. By the way, the silence that followed was, as they say, sweet enough to replace dessert. Lydia was staring at me with her mouth open. Connor had actually dropped his phone. Blake looked like he was trying to do math, but his brain had blue-screened. Margaret was clutching her pearls, literally clutching them like they were going to save her from this nightmare. And Richard? Richard looked like he'd just realized he'd been playing checkers while I'd been playing chess, and the game had been over for months. You own half my company, he said numbly. 51%, technically, I corrected, which makes it majority ownership, but hey, you still get to keep your title in your office. We're not monsters. We just restructured everything to actually make money instead of hemorrhaging cash on bad investments. Sebastian clapped me on the shoulder one more time. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you don't mess with Miles Sullivan. The man plays the long game better than anyone I know. The waiter appeared with impeccable timing, the kind of timing that suggested he'd been watching our table like a hawk, waiting for the exact moment when maximum awkwardness had been achieved. He carried a small black leather folder that probably cost more than most people's shoes. The kind of pretentious billing system that fancy restaurants use because apparently regular paper isn't good enough for people spending a mortgage payment on dinner. Richard's hand shot out for it like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. Pride, I realized, was the only thing he had left at this point, and paying for dinner was probably his last-ditch attempt to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that had spiraled so far out of his grasp it was orbiting Jupiter. I'll take that, Richard said.
His voice, from what I can only assume was suppressed, screaming, and damaged ego. The waiter looked uncertain, glancing between Richard and me like he was trying to figure out which person he should be more afraid of offending. Sebastian, who'd been making his way back to the kitchen, caught the interaction and turned around with the kind of grin that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this moment.
Actually, Sebastian said, walking back over with his hands in his pockets, dinner's already been taken care of. Richard blinked. What? It's covered, Sebastian said, taking the leather folder from the waiter and tucking it under his arm. By Mr. Sullivan here. Technically, since he's one of the owners now, his meals are complimentary anyway, and I'm extending that courtesy to his whole table tonight. I watched Richard's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally landing on a mixture of humiliation and rage that would have been concerning if it wasn't so absolutely deserved. You're joking, Richard said weakly. I grinned at him, the biggest, most obnoxious grin I could manage. Nope, not even a little bit. You're eating on my dime, Rich. Well, technically it's the restaurant's dime, but since I own part of the restaurant, it's sort of my dime by proxy. How's that salmon taste, knowing I paid for it? Blake made a choking sound. Connor was staring at his empty plate like it had betrayed him. Margaret looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair and never return. Lydia leaned forward, her voice a desperate whisper. Miles, please stop embarrassing them. I stood up, collecting my to-go box with the perfectly prepared Wagyu that I was absolutely taking home because waste not want. I looked down at Lydia, at her pleading expression, at the desperation in her eyes that wanted me to make this all go away, to smooth things over like I'd been doing for 3 years. Oh, honey, I said, my voice gentle but firm. That's impossible. They beat me to it years ago. I turned to Sebastian, who was still grinning like he'd just witnessed the best theater performance of his life. Thanks for dinner, man. We'll talk next week about the downtown project. Absolutely, Sebastian said, shaking my hand. This was the most entertaining Friday night I've had in months. Come back anytime, preferably with your in-laws. I walked out of Lou Ambrosia with my head high, my stake secure, and the sound of Richard's shattered pride echoing behind me. Best dinner ever. The lobby of Lou Ambrosia had never looked more beautiful than it did in my rearview mirror, metaphorically speaking, since I was still standing in it, my to-go box in hand, feeling like I just won the Super Bowl of family dinners. The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead like they were celebrating with me, and even Bernard, the snooty Matrai, gave me a respectful nod as I headed toward the exit. Funny how quickly respect appears when people realize you're not just some random guy, but actually someone who could, theoretically, fire them. I was almost at the door, so close to a clean exit, when Richard's voice cut through the lobby like a chainsaw through butter. You'll regret this. I stopped, turned around slowly like a gunslinger in a Western who knows he's already won, but wants to savor the moment. Richard was standing in the archway between the dining room and lobby, his face still that fascinating shade of crimson that suggested his cardiologist was going to have some strongly worded opinions at his next checkup. Richard, I said loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear, and trust me, they were all listening. The couple who'd been eavesdropping all night had actually followed us out, probably hoping for one last piece of drama. The only thing I regret is not charging you rent for sitting in my restaurant for the past 3 hours. The lobby erupted in laughter. Not the polite, restrained chuckling you usually hear in fancy establishments, but real, genuine laughter that echoed off the marble floors and probably violated some kind of upscale restaurant etiquette rule. Even the couple by the coat check were cracking up, the woman actually wiping tears from her eyes. Blake and Connor, standing behind their father like backup singers who'd forgotten their lyrics, couldn't help themselves. I saw them, both of them, chuckling behind their hands, trying to hide it from their dad, but failing miserably. Even Margaret had her hand over her mouth, and I'm pretty sure I saw the corner of her lips twitch upward before she remembered she was supposed to be maintaining dignity. Richard opened his mouth, closed it,
opened it again like a fish that had just realized it was out of water and things were not going well. No words came out. What could he say? I owned half his company, part of the restaurant he was standing in, and had just paid for his dinner. The man had no cards left to play. "Have a good night, Rich," I said cheerfully. "Thanks for the invitation to dinner. Really meant a lot." I walked out into the cool October night, feeling lighter than I had in 3 years.
A week later, I was sitting in Sebastian's office above the restaurant signing paperwork that would have seemed impossible a month ago. He'd been thinking about selling his remaining shares in Lou Ambrosia for a while, wanted to focus on opening new concepts, building the brand instead of managing day-to-day operations of the flagship location. When I made the offer to buy him out completely, he laughed and said something about how I'd always been better at the business side anyway. "You sure about this?" Sebastian asked, watching me initial the last page.
"Running a restaurant is different from investing in one. I've got good managers," I said. "And besides, I'm not planning to cook. I'm just planning to own it." He grinned and banned certain customers. That thought hadn't crossed my mind. I lied. But now that you mention it. We shook hands. Lou Ambrosia was officially mine. 3 months passed before the invitation came. It arrived in my mailbox.
The physical mailbox, because the handovers were old school like that, embossed and formal, inviting Mr. and Mrs. Miles Sullivan to a family dinner at Margaret's house. There was a handwritten note from Lydia tucked inside. "Please come. We need to talk. I miss you." I stood in my Tebeka penthouse, the one Lydia had never seen because she'd moved back in with her parents the week after the Lou Ambrosia incident, holding the invitation and thinking about what the appropriate response would be. I could go. We could talk. Maybe work things out, rebuild what we'd lost, start over with honesty this time. Or I could do what I actually did. I pulled out my laptop, ordered a $500 gift card to Lou Ambrosia, and had it delivered to the handover residence with a note written in my Nest handwriting. "Thanks for the invitation. Unfortunately, I have a prior commitment. Please enjoy dinner on me. I hear Lou Ambrosia is excellent, though it might be outside your usual budget.
Then again, maybe a burger joint would suit you better."
I signed it, sealed it, and sent it off without a second thought. 2 days later, my lawyer received divorce papers. I signed them immediately and sent them back with a settlement offer that was more than generous. Because despite everything, I'm not a monster. Just someone who finally learned that you can't make people respect you by making yourself smaller. And that, my friend, is how you serve revenge. Medium rare with a side of silence and a complimentary to-go box. Some dinners you eat, some dinners you survive, and some dinners you win. This one, I won. Hit that subscribe button right now. Lastly, download your audiobook titled Brutal Cheating Stories That Shock the World by clicking the link in the pinned comment.